I'm going to make a claim today that is maybe a bit counterintuitive, which is namely that Hannah Arendt has shaped her views on Christian theology through her engagement with Zionist politics. So that might sound, how could that be? Why would, she wrote her doctoral dissertation on Augustine. So clearly much of her writings on the state of Israel, etc., come later on. But I would like to point out that she herself actually writes at the beginning of her late work that was actually published after her death, The Life of the Mind. At the beginning of The Life of the Mind, a work that largely deals with St. Augustine, she writes that she developed those ideas while being in the Eichmann trial in Israel. So actually, Arendt already told us that she continued developing her engagement with Christian theology through her engagement with Zionist politics, with Jewish history. And so in this paper, I'm trying to explore how and why that happened. Okay, I'm just going to read my lecture now. Gershon Scholem's famous admonition, according to which his interlocutor Hannah Arendt lacks Ahavat Israel, love for fellow Jews, has long juxtaposed her to other Jewish thinkers. This accusation portrayed Arendt as a traitor who does not remain loyal to her Jewish origins in exerting critique of the Jewish state, a political entity that, in Scholem's mind, was the ultimate materialization of Jewish politics. The persisting examination of Arendt as a Jewish thinker underplays a main aspect of her thought, a long-standing engagement with Christian theology. Arendt developed key notions pertaining to politics reading ancient Christianity. She relied especially on St. Augustine, the figure to whom she dedicated her doctoral dissertation. Augustine was a constant influence on such works as The Human Condition and The Life of the Mind. As I will show throughout her oeuvre, Arendt revisits Augustine in tandem with the enveloping of her comments on Jewish politics. This reciprocity changes in tandem with Arendt's exposure to new historical events, particularly those related to the Nazi atrocities and to the rise of the Jewish state. In this presentation, I wish to discern how Arendt's writings on Jewish politics build on her ongoing engagement with Augustine and vice versa. My examination centers on Arendt's notion of agency, action, and social accountability. Informed by Arendt's interpretation of Augustine, those notions wear new pertinence in such works as Eichmann in Jerusalem, works that seek to comment on contemporary Jewish politics and on the veracity of the Jewish state as a political agent. Arendt's choice of topic for a doctoral dissertation, love in St. Augustine's writing, may appear peculiar. How is this choice related to a politically engaged young scholar's interests? By and large, Arendt reads Augustine as a theoretician of human existence, a reading that was informed by her occupation with existentialism in the thought of Jaspers, Heidegger, and Bultmann. Arendt contends that early Christianity held to a vision of free will that is starkly different from its conception in modernity, particularly from its liberal adaptation. So for early Christian thinkers, freedom related primarily to freedom of choice, a quality that is separated from the public realm of politics. Arendt argues that these thinkers were intimidated by an exposure to the outside world. They evoked sin as a constant threat that is integral to one's freedom of action. The early Christian tradition presented the will as entangled in an inner struggle, disengaging the predicate I will from I can. So I will unpack this. Arendt's critique of modern politics resonates with several principles of her engagement with those early Christian thinkers. In her lecture, What is Freedom?, she writes, I quote, "In the deadly conflict with worldly desires and intentions from which willpower was supposed to liberate the self, the most willing seems able to achieve was oppression. Because of the will's impotence, its incapability to generate genuine power, its constant defeat in the struggle with the self, the will to power turned at once into will to oppression." I can only hint here the fatal consequences for political theory of this equation of freedom with the human capacity to will. It was one of these causes why even today we automatically equate power with oppression, or at least with rule over others. So think about it this way. I mean, end of quote. I want to, I think it's quite a complicated idea in my view. Think about it this way. Let's say that I want to lose weight, but I also want to eat chocolate. So, and if I manage to stick to my diet, this is an act of self-governance in which I manage to have an ego, Arendt would call it, that suppressed my other will. So this act of self-governance is quite the opposite of freedom. So Arendt goes ahead, I will read you another quote from this lecture. She goes ahead to disengage freedom from sovereignty, from self-governance. So a problem inherent to modern politics is the association of sovereignty of the individual, of a group of people, with freedom, and of political power with the oppression of others, as we've just seen. Modern political institutions advocate sovereignty as the means to grant citizens political freedom, but they enforce their sovereignty in means that harm individuals' personal freedom, and they eliminate thereby the basic notion of politics. This problem goes back, according to Arendt, to early Christianity's legacy, and namely early Christian discovery of the will as a quality that conflicts with self-governance. So Arendt writes, where men wish to be sovereign as individuals or as organized groups, they must submit to the oppression of the will. Be this like the example I just gave. Be this the individual will with which I force myself, or the general will of an organized group. If men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty that they must renounce. End of quote. In Arendt's mind, while Augustine disseminated the early Christian notion of will, which confines free will to the inner conflict with the self, Augustine manages to rescue a notion of freedom that entertains the veracity of human action. So what Arendt names the gift of action corresponds with Augustine's notion of birth, of human birth, as signifying beginning, openness, and radical potential. What follows is an account that defines action as parallel to the divine creation of man. In the human condition, Arendt, it's a work from 1958, Arendt declares in connection with what she names Augustine's political philosophy that, I quote, with the creation of man, the principle of beginning came into the world, which of course is only another way of saying that the principle of freedom was created when man was created, but not before, end of quote. In grounding action in a theological conception of human freedom, Arendt developed a notion of political agency that targets the world as a sphere open to transformation. She conceives political action as spontaneous. Its outcomes are necessarily unexpected, a quality that in Arendt's mind is integral to human existence. In a few places in her oeuvre, Arendt refers to the outcome of political action with miracles, by referring to miracles, particularly those performed by Jesus, as they were conceived in early Christianity. So this is for her a manifestation of spontaneity. The notion of the caritas, one of the words that Augustine uses for love, informs Arendt's reading of Augustine as a thinker who conceptualizes ethical human engagement with the world. According to Arendt, in coining this notion of the caritas, Augustine wishes to reconcile the Neoplatonic striving for a transcendental power with humans' earthly life. One's love for one's neighbor is always uneasy. It's an ethical demand. In short, the command to love fellow humans indicated in this concept attaches to interpersonal relationship a transcendental essence. Now, the openness of political action and the ethical dimension of Augustine's thought constitute a central notion of human existence. Individuals' constant awareness of other individuals who cohabit Earth. Love to fellow humans entails recognition of existential unpredictability, which derives from others' political actions. Importantly, Arendt argues that certain historical transformations have shaped those qualities of human action. She approaches critically some tendencies of Enlightenment philosophy, which in her mind has instilled in civilization the notion that the world should be investigated rather than lived in. Science and notions of progress, particularly those connected to modern technology, entailed an instrumental approach to the world. A crucial caesura is the rise of fascism. According to Arendt, totalitarian regimes brought the openness of human actions to a halt. In Arendt's reading, Augustine conceives of Earth as a sphere in which human beings are accountable for each other, or at least constantly aware of each other's existence in the world. She takes Augustine's notion of natality to be consistent of this awareness. She contends that for Augustine, the moment of creation distinguishes the organism from the creator, and hence creation signifies the independence of the organism from others' actions. Separated from God, the men share in this sense the divine freedom of action. Now moving to the state of Israel and Zionist politics to kind of try to make this counterintuitive argument. Arendt's interpretation of Jewish history contended that religious minorities hold an elusive claim to power. An article that she contributed to the Aufbau foregrounds the conflicts of Jewish history in Zionist politics. Arendt opposed two leading ventures of Zionist politics that crystallized in the 1930s and the 1940s. So famously, the first was the idea of establishing in Palestine a Jewish commonwealth, and by so doing, according to her, ignoring or making local Arab citizens deprivileged, as well as ignoring the overall Arab surroundings of the Jewish state. Now, the second plan that she at first opposed, later on she was a bit more tolerant to, is the Magnus's group of Ichud, and what they try to do is to establish in Israel a binational Arab-Jewish state. Now, this plan did not quite fit into Arendt's notion of an independent new federation. So this is a long discussion, and I can't quite delve into it. But the idea that there will be a binational Arab-Jewish state is not quite the way she imagined a completely new, novel political form of federation of citizens who are not situated in the state by means of their ethnic and religious identity. So it's not about Arab and Jews living together, but it's about establishing a state that in Arendt's mind is much closer to the United States. That's a preferred political model for her. A main point of Arendt's disapproval of Zionist politics was the refusal of main political Jewish institutions to endorse a Jewish army. In Arendt's mind, such army would fill a gap evident in Jewish history, the lack of genuine immersion in local politics. The Nazi threat would best be addressed, she thought, with a centralized Jewish army, since, in her mind, a fighting Jew always protects himself as a Jew and not as a member of a nation state. Jews should seek to oppose the Nazis not through national sovereignty, that is, by erecting a Jewish state, but rather by establishing an international collective that dissociates power from sovereignty. Zionist politicians' renunciation of the plan to establish a Jewish army made Arendt attack not only the weakness of global Jewish politics, but also its opportunism. I'm reading from another article in the Aufbau from 1942. I quote, "Jewish politics, to the extent that it exists at all, is run by people who have likewise grown up without ever growing powerful, worshipping power and opportunistic success. Their admiration of those who hold power on this earth and their reluctance to mobilize the energies of their own people have cost us the deployment of a Jewish army," end of quote. The establishment of a Jewish army transformed in 1941 and 2 from a vision of an independent and centralized entity into a military unit that would serve under the British Army. Arendt attached this transformation to what she saw as Jewish politicians' opportunism, their ostensible attempts to cater to the taste of imperialistic powers, transformed the vision of a military Jewish resistance into a colonial effort. In her essay To Save the Jewish State, Arendt argues that since the adoption of the Baltimore program, all opposition within the Jewish ranks had steadily disappeared, and all Zionist groups were now committed to the establishment of a nation state, with any opposition being considered treason. So this is really what she was against. Arendt suggested that this shift was a result of a transformation in what she called the Jewish national character in the wake of the European catastrophe. I quote, "The Jewish catastrophe instilled the fear that everybody is against us." Now, according to Arendt's line of argumentation, Jewish politics endorses sovereignty as a sole goal of political action. This goal associates freedom with self-governance. Think about the State of Israel's national hymn. Freedom is associated with self-governance and takes both of them to deny equivalent sovereignty from others. So this is the quotes that I try to explicate from the Life of the Mind, that the problematic legacy of ancient Christianity is that we think in order to be free, we should be sovereign, and we can't have others have equivalent sovereignty. Not only the language of Arendt's critique of Jewish politics, but also her claims that Zionist leaders failed to establish a novel political model like the Federation, forestalled her writings on ancient Christianity in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Jewish leaders' attachment to standard notion of sovereignty are emblematic of the problems that she finds in modern politics. Now, I'll finish with one last instance of the argument that I want to make, which is namely from the Eichmann trial. In her famous account of the trial, Arendt takes seriously Eichmann's lines of defense, according to which he filled an instrumental role in the annihilation of European Jewry, merely obeying orders, that is, without thinking about the procedures in which he was participating. She solicits from this defense a provocative conclusion, according to which conscience is the byproduct of thinking on one's action. Since Eichmann was not thinking about his action, as he claims, he did not experience remorse or regret. Famously, Arendt reports on the trial draws several lines of critique of the state of Israel. In her mind, the rise of fascism limited dramatically the potentiality and openness of human action. I think that the main problem, really, in my view, the main critique that she draws is that the state of Israel followed the strict ethnic and religious line of defense. So instead of claiming that or accusing Eichmann of committing crimes against humanity, the state of Israel focuses on Eichmann as someone who committed crimes against Jews. So, and she writes it, she writes it in the report. Israel emerges in the report as a political entity that is really quite obsessed with self-presenting itself as representing world Jewry. The state wishes to establish itself as the representative of the Holocaust survivors. Now, this aim has brought about, Arendt claims, a series of violations of international law, including the very act of kidnapping Eichmann and bringing him to Israel. Now, close to the end of her report, Arendt reflects on the reasoning of punishing Eichmann, and she formulates famously what Israel should have articulated, should have said in explaining Eichmann's punishment. I quote, "We are concerned here not only with what you did and not with the possible non-criminal nature of your inner life and of your motives, or with the criminal potentialities of those around you. In politics, obedience and support are the same. And just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you." So Eichmann canceled out human coexistence, the grounds of universal politics, as Arendt establishes in her readings of St. Augustine. In other words, the state of Israel should have correlated the capital punishment not to the violence against an ethnic and religious minority, but to Eichmann's threat to universal politics. I will finish. Arendt's late work, The Light of the Mind, closes the circle of her long-standing engagement with with Augustine, that is based, as she testifies, on her views from the Eichmann trial. I propose two case studies that demonstrate that Arendt's critique of Jewish politics is related to her interpretation of Augustine. One was the Eichmann report that echoes the notion of Earth as populated by individuals that are accountable for each other's concurrent actions. Arendt's reformulation of Israel's verdict reminds us of her reliance on Augustine. Now, the unsuccessful attempt to establish an independent Jewish army is emblematic of another bigger failure, according to Arendt, the inability really to detach power from negative associations that include oppression of others. Now, those are faults that Arendt associates with the state of Israel in its various stages of emergence. They are correlated to that state's ostensible inability to stand up to the ideals that Arendt establishes in her reading of Augustine. Thank you.